I didn't notice anything was wrong at first. It was supposed to be an easy afternoon, a few stores, coffee, nothing serious. My sister Marissa walked beside me carrying a bag she didn't need, scanning racks, like she was killing time instead of shopping. I remember thinking she looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work, but from paying attention to everything all the time. We were halfway through a department store when she stopped walking. She didn't say my name. She didn't raise her voice. She just reached out and wrapped her hand around my forearm, tight enough that it wasn't casual. "Shh," she said. "Don't move." I froze where I stood, a rack of jackets brushing my shoulder. My first instinct was irritation. Then I heard the rest of it. "Look, not up, not around, down." I bent slightly the way you do when you don't want to be obvious about it, and that was when my body reacted before my brain caught up. Under the gap between the clothing rack and the floor, I saw shoes that had stopped too close, black, polished, facing us. They didn't shift, they didn't turn, they just stayed there. I didn't say anything. Marissa's grip tightened, her nails digging through my sleeve. Her breathing changed, shorter, controlled. I knew that sound. I'd heard it before years ago when she used to sleep with the lights on and triple-check the locks. "Bathroom," she murmured. "Now." We didn't rush. Rushing draws attention. We walked like two people who had simply decided they needed a restroom. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The weight in my chest told me everything I needed to know. The women's restroom was empty when we stepped inside. Fluorescent lights, tile floors, the usual smell of soap, and something chemical pretending to be clean. Marissa pulled me straight into the first stall and locked the door behind us. That's when she leaned in close enough that I could feel her breath on my ear. "He followed us from the shoe store," she whispered. "He stopped every time we stopped." I crouched down without thinking. Habit, training. When you don't know what's happening, you change your angle and gather information. Through the narrow gap under the stall door, I saw the same black shoes step into the restroom. They paused. A voice followed. Calm, male, too calm. "Yeah," he said, speaking into a phone. "Two women, sisters, I think. One's wearing a dark jacket. They're in the restroom now." Marissa went rigid. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I let my phone slide out of my pocket and started recording without looking at the screen. I kept it low, pressed against my thigh. The shoes moved again. Slow steps. One stall, stop. Another stall, stop. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't sloppy. Whoever this was, he wasn't worried about being seen. My pulse stayed steady. That part surprised me. Fear came later. In the moment, everything felt flat and sharp, like my brain had switched into a different mode. I listened to the rhythm of his steps. I counted the stalls. I waited. "He should be in here," the man said as still on the phone. "Yeah, I'll check." The shoes stopped directly in front of our stall. Marissa's hand slid into mine, and I felt the shake she was trying to control. I squeezed back once. Not reassurance, a signal. Stay still. The lock on our door rattled just slightly, like someone testing it without committing. Then the shoes moved on. The man continued toward the sinks, his voice lowering as if privacy mattered now. I took that moment. I stood, unlocked the stall, and pulled Marissa with me. We didn't run. We slipped out fast and quiet, straight past the sinks, and out the door. Mall security was 2 hallways down, tucked into an office that looked like it had been added as an afterthought. The guard behind the desk glanced up with the kind of bored readiness reserved for complaints about parking or return policies. "There's a man following women into the restroom," I said. "He's on his phone. Black shoes, dark jacket." That got his attention. We stayed there while another guard went to check. I kept my phone recording until my hand started to ache. Marissa sat beside me, arms folded tight across her chest, staring at the floor like she was counting tiles. They brought the man back 10 minutes later. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't look surprised. Mid-40s, neatly trimmed hair, button-down shirt under a jacket that didn't belong to a uniform, but tried to look like one. He met my eyes with a mild professional expression, the kind people use when they believe they're about to explain something simple. "I'm Thomas Reed," he said calmly, "private security consultant." "Then you picked the wrong restroom," one of the guards said. Reed smiled thinly. "I'm conducting an observation." I didn't enter a stall. I played back the audio on my phone without saying a word. His own voice filled the small office, describing us like items on a checklist. The smile faded. Security called the police. Procedure. Reed sat quietly, hands folded like he was waiting for a delayed appointment. When the officers arrived, he repeated the same explanation. Observation, contract, nothing illegal. Marissa finally looked up. I've seen him before, she said. Near my sister's apartment, weeks ago. Reed's eyes flicked to her just for a second. It was the first real reaction I'd seen from him. I watched that moment carefully, not with anger, not with panic, with the same focus I used during briefings and reports. Because this wasn't random, and it wasn't over. The officers asked us questions, names, where we'd been, how long we thought we were followed. Reed answered their questions too, offering just enough to sound cooperative without giving anything away. When they let us leave, the mall felt different, louder, wider. Every reflective surface caught my attention. Marissa stayed close, her shoulder brushing mine as we walked. Neither of us suggested going home right away. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there with my hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. The adrenaline had worn off. What was left was something colder. Patterns. People don't stalk in public places without confidence. They don't narrate into a phone unless they expect someone to be listening. And they don't choose targets without a reason. Marissa buckled her seatbelt slowly, like sudden movements were still a bad idea. That wasn't your imagination, she said quietly. I know what that looks like. I nodded once. The engine turned over smooth and familiar. I pulled out of the parking lot, already running through timelines in my head. Already aware that whatever had followed us into that restroom hadn't stayed there. The car doors closed with a solid thud that felt louder than it should have. I pulled onto the road without turning on the radio. The silence gave me room to think, and thinking was already happening whether I wanted it to or not. Marissa broke it first. He wasn't guessing, she said. About us. I kept my eyes on traffic. No, he knew we were sisters, she continued. Not just two women shopping together. That detail had lodged itself in my head the moment Reed said it. Sisters, not friends, not strangers, family. That meant observation over time, or information handed to him by someone who already knew us. Neither option was comforting. We didn't go straight home. I stopped at a grocery store on the way, the kind of place with wide aisles and good lighting. Normal, predictable. Marissa didn't argue. She stayed close, her posture relaxed enough to pass, but her eyes never stopped moving. Inside, everything felt louder. Shopping carts, announcements over the speakers, people talking too close. I caught myself scanning reflections in freezer doors, checking corners the way I did when I was overseas, and didn't trust the calm. Nothing happened. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. By the time we got back to my apartment, the sun was starting to drop. I parked where I could see the entrance from my window and didn't linger in the car. Keys out, door open, inside, locked. Marissa stood in the living room and exhaled like she'd been holding it since the mall. Okay, she said. Now we talk. I set my phone on the table and pulled up the recording again. Reed's voice filled the room, calm and precise. No hesitation, no panic. The sound of someone doing a job. I've heard that tone before, Marissa said. My ex used it when he thought he was being clever. I looked at her. When she sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped between her knees. When he hired someone to check if I was really going to work or really going to see my sister. When he wanted proof. The word proof sat there heavy. Marissa had moved in with me 3 months earlier after her divorce finalized. She said it was temporary. I didn't ask how temporary. She slept better here. That was enough. You said you saw him before, I said. The guy from the mall. Twice, she replied. Once near your building, once near the pharmacy down the street. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to sound paranoid. I nodded. I understood that instinct better than I liked. I opened my laptop and started a new document. No title, just dates. Mall incident today. First sighting near my building, Marissa gave me an approximate date. 2 weeks ago, mid-afternoon. He'd been standing across the street pretending to scroll on his phone, gone when she looked back. Pharmacy a few days later. Same guy, same jacket. I typed it all out, keeping it factual. Times, locations, no emotions. Emotions cloud reports. I should call someone, Marissa said. The police, maybe. They already have his name, I said. That doesn't mean they have his purpose. She frowned. You think they'll let him go? I think they won't hold him without something concrete. That was the part civilians hated. The part where nothing happened yet, so nothing could be done. I'd lived inside that gap long enough to know how wide it could be. My phone buzzed on the table. Mom. I ignored it. Marissa noticed. Everything okay? It can wait. It rang again. This time I answered. Hey, sweetheart. My mother-in-law said, her voice smooth and concerned. I heard there was some kind of incident at the mall. I closed my eyes for half a second. Heard from who? I asked. Oh, she said lightly. Someone from church mentioned police activity. I just wanted to make sure you're all right. I looked at Marissa, her eyebrows lifted. We're fine, I said. It was handled. That's good, Margaret replied. You've been under so much stress lately. I worry about you. I ended the call before she could continue. Marissa stared at me. That was fast. Too fast, I said. Margaret didn't live nearby. She didn't shop at that mall. And she definitely didn't get real-time updates from church friends about police responses. I added a new line to the document. Margaret called less than an hour after incident. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was scared, because my mind wouldn't stop organizing. I replayed Reed's posture, his wording, the way he'd said observation like it was a harmless hobby, the way his eyes had flicked to Marissa when she mentioned seeing him before. He hadn't expected her to talk. In the morning, I went to work. Routine matters when everything else feels off. I drove to base, parked in the same spot I always did, walked the same route. No detours, no dramatics. At my desk, I checked my schedule. Normal, meetings, reports, an evaluation coming up in 2 weeks. Nothing out of place. Except I kept noticing small things. A question from a colleague about my availability that felt oddly specific. A reminder email about a wellness check I didn't remember requesting. Harmless on their own. Patterns when stacked. At lunch, I sat alone and pulled up my personal calendar, cross-referenced it with the dates Marissa had given me. The pharmacy visit lined up with a late shift. The sighting near my building matched a day I'd come home early. None of it was classified. None of it was secret. But together, it painted a clear picture of my movements. Someone had been paying attention. When I got home that evening, Marissa was standing by the window watching the street. Car parked across from the building for about 20 minutes, she said. Left when I picked up my phone. What kind of car? She described it. Generic. Rental level forgettable. I wrote it down anyway. We ate dinner without talking much. Neither of us had much appetite. Afterward, I checked the locks, the windows, the hallway camera feed my neighbor had installed after a package theft. Everything looked normal. Normal didn't mean safe. Before bed, I backed up the audio file from the mall to 2 places. I sent a copy to an email account Margaret didn't know existed. I labeled the folder with the date and Reed's name. Marissa watched from the doorway. You think this is about you? She asked. I think it's about control, I said. And I think it started before today. She nodded slowly. Then you're not crazy. I know. Lying in bed later staring at the ceiling, I listened to the quiet of the apartment. The familiar hum of the fridge, a car passing outside. Ordinary sounds doing ordinary things. Somewhere in the city, Thomas Reed was also settling in for the night, probably convinced his day had gone slightly off plan, but not off course. And somewhere else, someone had picked up a phone and asked for an update. The morning Daniel died, the knock came too early. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the uniforms, not the careful expressions, just the hour. People don't knock like that unless something has already gone wrong. I let them in, I listened, I nodded at the right places. Training helps with that. So does shock. Daniel had been a logistics officer, the kind of job people underestimate because it doesn't come with dramatic footage. His unit was running a routine transport exercise when a vehicle failed on a narrow access road. No gunfire, no enemy, just weight speed and physics. The report was clean, clinical, final. At the service, the flags were folded with perfect precision. His name was spoken clearly. I stood straight. I thanked people for coming. I did everything you're supposed to do when your world has been reduced to a single rectangle of wood and cloth. Margaret stood beside me the entire time. She held my hand. She brought food. She told everyone how proud Daniel had been of me, how he used to talk about my discipline, my focus. She said it with a smile that never wavered. You were his strength, she told me more than once. He needed someone steady. At the time, it sounded like comfort. 2 weeks later, my command recommended extended leave. Counseling, time to adjust. I listened. I considered it. Then I declined most of it. I went back to work. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't denial. It was structure. When everything else fell apart, the schedule held. Morning briefings, clear objectives, measured progress. I could breathe inside that. Margaret didn't agree. She came by my apartment unannounced one evening with containers of food and a look that suggested she'd already decided what was best. "You're pushing yourself," she said, setting the food down. "Daniel wouldn't want that." "He trusted my judgment," I replied. She smiled. "He trusted me too." I didn't argue. Grief makes you tired and arguments take energy. She stayed for an hour asking questions that felt normal enough. How were my nights? Was I sleeping? Did I feel distracted at work? Had anyone mentioned concerns? I answered honestly. I was tired. I slept in short stretches. Work was fine. She nodded, storing it all away. Over the next month, her visits became more regular, always framed as help. She offered to handle paperwork, to make calls, to check in with people who cared about Daniel's legacy. That word came up a lot, legacy. One afternoon, she asked about my upcoming evaluation. "It's standard," I said. "Everyone gets one." Still, she replied, "Those things matter, especially for someone in your position." I didn't think much of it then. Evaluations had always been part of the job. Transparent, predictable. You meet the standards, or you don't. When Marissa called to tell me her marriage was over, I didn't hesitate. She needed a place to land. I had space. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a quiet intensity I recognized immediately. Hyper-awareness, startled response, the look of someone who had learned to read rooms the hard way. Margaret welcomed her warmly, too warmly. "So good you have family close," she said. "Especially now." Marissa smiled politely. Later, she leaned over and whispered, "She asks a lot of questions." "About what?" "About you." I shrugged it off. Margaret had always been curious. Curious people ask questions. That was the story I told myself. 3 weeks later, Margaret mentioned my schedule in a way that made me pause. "I know Tuesdays are long for you," she said casually. "Back-to-back meetings, right?" I looked up from my coffee. "How do you know that?" She waved a hand. "Daniel used to talk about your routines." Daniel had never cared about my meeting blocks. He cared that I was home for dinner when I could be. That was it. I let it go, then she asked about my wellness check. "I haven't had one yet," I said. She frowned. "I thought they required those after a loss. They recommend them." "Well," she said gently. "Recommendations exist for a reason." The tone shifted there, just slightly, concern layered with something firmer underneath. I noticed it, filed it away, and moved on. Around that time, Marissa started taking longer routes when she walked to the store. She didn't announce it, she just did it. "Old habit," she said when I asked. "Nothing to worry about." I didn't press. I should have. Margaret called more often, sometimes twice a day, always brief, always checking in, always ending with some variation of, "You don't have to do this alone." I knew what alone felt like. This wasn't it. At work, things stayed steady. No red flags, no whispers. But I started noticing how often my name came up in conversations I wasn't part of. How people asked questions that seemed preloaded. "How are you holding up?" someone asked me one afternoon. "Really, fine," I said. They nodded like that wasn't the answer they'd expected. One evening, Marissa mentioned seeing a man across the street from my building. I told her it was probably nothing. The city was full of people standing around pretending to be somewhere else. She didn't look convinced. "I've been wrong before," she said, "but not often." That was the first time I felt the edge of something I couldn't define yet. Not fear, awareness. Margaret stopped by the next day with a folder. "I organized some things," she said, "just in case." Inside were copies of documents I hadn't given her, appointment reminders, benefit summaries, notes from conversations I didn't remember having with her. "Where did you get these?" I asked. She met my eyes without blinking. I asked. That answer bothered me more than any other. By the time the mall incident happened, the groundwork had already been laid. The questions, the records, the quiet accumulation of information that looked harmless on its own. 6 months earlier, I had been too busy surviving to notice the pattern forming around me. Now, sitting in my apartment with Marissa and a growing list of dates, I could see it clearly. Not as a story, not as a theory, as a process. Seeing it as a process changed how everything felt. The unease stopped being emotional and turned procedural. I didn't confront anyone. I adjusted. Margaret called the next morning while I was tying my boots. I let it ring once before answering. "I was thinking about you last night," she said. "You sounded tired." I replied, checking the weather out of habit. "Long day. Still pushing yourself," she said gently. "That worries me." It was the same sentence she'd used before, but the timing was off. Too early. Too precise. I've got to head in, I said. Talk later, she paused. You're on the early shift today. Yes, I thought Tuesdays were meetings. They are, I said. Later. Another pause. Short, controlled. Well, she said, drive safe. I hung up and added a note to the document on my phone. Nothing dramatic. Just a timestamp and a sentence. Margaret knew my shift change. At work, the day unfolded normally. Briefings, updates, a small delay in transport schedules that ate up more time than it should have. I handled it. That was my job. I kept my head down and my responses clean. During lunch, a supervisor I barely interacted with stopped by my desk. Just checking in, he said. Command wants to make sure you've got support. I do, I said. He nodded, satisfied enough, and walked away. The exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds. It still didn't sit right. When I got home, Marissa was in the kitchen rearranging the spice rack for the third time that week. She looked up when she heard the door. She called you, didn't she? She said. Yes. What did she ask? I told her. Not all of it, just enough. Marissa leaned against the counter. That's not concern, she said. That's monitoring. I know, she did this to my ex. Marissa added. Different words, same rhythm. That night, Margaret showed up unannounced again. She knocked once lightly like she already expected the door to open. I brought soup, she said, stepping inside before I could answer. Marissa stayed in the living room. She didn't greet Margaret. She didn't hide either. Margaret's eyes flicked to her and back to me. You look exhausted, Margaret said, setting the container down. Have you been sleeping enough? I replied. She studied my face. Enough isn't the same as well. I watched her hands. They were steady. No tremor, no nerves. I spoke to someone today, she continued. A friend. She mentioned how hard it is for women in your position. All that responsibility. What position is that? I asked. She smiled. Widowed, active duty, alone. I'm not alone, I said. She glanced at Marissa again. I know, I just meant in the long run. Marissa finally spoke. That's a strange thing to say. Margaret turned to her. I didn't mean anything by it. You usually do, Marissa replied. The room tightened. Margaret recovered quickly. I just worry, that's all. It's my job. It's not, I said. She looked surprised. Genuinely this time. I'm Daniel's mother, she said. I lost my son. I lost my husband, I replied. Those are not the same. The silence that followed was sharp. Margaret picked up her purse. I can see you're both emotional, she said. We'll talk another time. After she left, Marissa exhaled slowly. That, she said, wasn't nothing. No, I agreed. Over the next week, the calls continued. Short, polite, framed as care, always landing near something specific. A meeting, a deadline, a check-in I hadn't mentioned. I stopped answering some of them. She noticed. When I didn't return a call one afternoon, she texted, just making sure you're okay. I didn't reply. At work, the wellness check appeared on my calendar, mandatory, scheduled by someone else. I went, answered the questions, kept everything factual. Stress was expected. Grief was normal. My performance metrics were solid. The clinician nodded and typed. I don't see any red flags, she said, but it's good we're keeping an eye on things. Keeping an eye on things. The phrase stuck with me. That evening I walked home instead of driving. I took a longer route looping through side streets I rarely used. Halfway back I felt it again. That sense of being paced. I stopped at a crosswalk and pretended to check my phone. In the reflection of a darkened storefront, I saw a man slow down across the street. Same height, same build, different jacket. I didn't react. I crossed when the light changed and turned the corner without breaking stride. When I glanced back, he was gone. At home, Marissa was waiting. You too, she asked. Yes. She nodded like that confirmed something she'd already suspected. That night, I pulled together everything I had. Dates, calls, appearances, comments. I didn't label it harassment. I didn't label it stalking. Labels came later. I labeled it pattern. When Margaret called the next morning, I answered. I think you should slow down, she said without preamble. This pace isn't sustainable, according to who I asked. To anyone paying attention, she replied. I am paying attention, I said. Very closely. She paused. I don't like your tone. I don't like being tracked, I said. The line went quiet. I don't know what you mean, she said finally. That's fine, I replied. We can talk when you do. I ended the call and sat there for a moment listening to the absence of sound. not relief, not satisfaction, just clarity. Marissa watched me from across the table. She knows you're onto something, she said. Yes. And she won't stop. No. Outside, a car idled longer than necessary before pulling away. I didn't look out the window. I wrote it down instead, adding one more entry to a list that was no longer theoretical. Concern can be sincere. It can also be sharpened into something else entirely. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't tired. My mind had settled into that narrow lane where everything lines up and starts making sense. Not emotionally, structurally. The first thing I did in the morning was change my routine, not in a dramatic way. No disguises, no sudden disappearances. I left the apartment at my usual time, took my usual stairs, and walked my usual block. Then instead of turning right toward the parking lot, I crossed the street and headed left. Nothing happened for 2 blocks. On the third, I slowed just enough to glance at a darkened car window. A reflection moved when I did. Not fast, not obvious, just enough. I didn't look again. At work, I kept my calendar open on a second screen. Meetings, check-ins, deadlines. All of it was ordinary. That was the point. Whatever was happening didn't rely on secrets. It relied on habits. I left my office 10 minutes earlier than scheduled for lunch and walked past the cafeteria without stopping. I took the long hallway that ran behind supply and cut through the back exit. The sun hit harder than expected. I crossed the lot, waited, then turned. A man stepped out from behind a service truck and pretended to adjust his phone. Different jacket, same posture. I didn't confront him. Confrontation is what people expect when they think they've been spotted. I kept walking, changed direction again, and entered a building I didn't need to be in. When I exited through the other side, the space behind me was empty. At my desk, I added 3 lines to the document. Deviation from routine followed. Visual contact consistent across locations. Observer adapts to changes. Marissa texted me around noon. Saw him again near the corner store. Same guy. I replied with one word, noted. That afternoon, Margaret didn't call. That alone would have been unusual a week earlier. Now it felt deliberate. Instead, I received an email forwarded by a coworker, a reminder about a voluntary family support seminar hosted by a community group for military families. The sender was someone I recognized from base events. Margaret's name was listed as a contact. I didn't attend. The following day, a different approach. A voicemail left while I was in a briefing. Just checking in, Margaret said. I spoke to someone who's very concerned about how much pressure you're under. I don't want this to become an issue later. Issue was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I didn't call back. I stopped by the pharmacy after work, the same one Marissa had mentioned weeks earlier. I went inside, bought nothing, and stood near the window pretending to read labels. 10 minutes passed. A man stood across the street looking at his phone. When I stepped outside, he turned away. That night, Marissa and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open between us. I scrolled through the entries, slowly letting the spacing tell the story. He's not following you randomly, she said. He's checking, confirming, I replied. Adjusting, like he's answering to someone. Yes. I pulled up my call logs. Margaret's name appeared more often than anyone else's. The timing lined up with several of the sightings. Not perfectly. Close enough. She's not giving him live updates, Marissa said. She doesn't need to. No, I agreed. She's giving him expectations. We didn't say anything else for a moment. Then Marissa leaned back. When my ex did this, the guy he hired wasn't looking for dirt. He was building a narrative. What kind? That I was unstable, inconsistent, that I couldn't be trusted to manage things on my own. I nodded. That matched what I was seeing. Not surveillance for a crime, observation for a profile. The next morning, I called a number I hadn't used in years, a former colleague who'd transitioned into civilian compliance work. I kept it vague, asked about private investigators, contractors, the limits of what they could legally do without crossing lines. Most of it's boring, he said, watching, noting patterns, talking to people who talk too much. And when it's family-driven, I asked. There was a pause. That's messier, because the information doesn't look stolen, it looks shared. That afternoon, I received a calendar invite for a follow-up wellness meeting. Not mandatory, strongly encouraged. I accepted it. At home, Marissa watched me pack a small bag. You're not scared, she said. You're annoyed. Yes, that's worse for them. She wasn't wrong. I drove a different route to the meeting and arrived early. I sat in the car and watched the entrance. A man walked past, slowed, glanced toward my vehicle, and kept going. Not Reed, someone else. Younger, less polished. They were rotating. Inside, the conversation was polite and professional. Questions about workload, support systems, balance. I answered cleanly, no defensiveness, no oversharing. Afterward, I walked out with the clinician. We parted ways at the door. I paused, turned, and went back inside through a side exit. The parking lot behind the building was nearly empty. A sedan idled near the far fence. When I stepped into view, it pulled away. That made 5. 5 separate confirmations in 4 days, different locations, same behavior. At home, I updated the document again. Multiple observers, same objective. Marissa brought 2 mugs of coffee and set one down in front of me. "You're being watched like a case," she said. "Yes." "And the case is you." "Yes." My phone buzzed. A text this time. "Margaret, I hope you're not misunderstanding my concern." I typed back once, then erased it. Typed again, deleted that too. Finally, I sent a single sentence. "Concern doesn't require this level of attention." The reply came faster than expected. "I don't know what you're implying." I set the phone face down. Outside, the street was quiet. No cars lingering, no obvious movement. That didn't mean anything had stopped. It meant it had settled into a rhythm. Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat until they're undeniable. By the end of the week, I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't reacting, I was tracking. I stopped adjusting my routes and started standardizing them again, not because the attention had faded, but because consistency makes data cleaner. If someone was watching, I wanted to know what they saw when nothing changed. The report didn't begin as an accusation, it began as a record. I filed it through the proper channel, attached dates, times, locations, and audio. No speculation, no conclusions. Just observations. The kind that read boring unless you line them up side by side. My supervisor skimmed the first page and nodded. "You did this right," he said. "We'll route it." Route it meant delay review and careful language. It meant my name would be discussed in rooms I wasn't in. I accepted that. Procedure exists for a reason, even when it's inconvenient. By the afternoon, I was scheduled for a meeting I hadn't requested. The room was small, neutral. A table, 2 chairs, a box of tissues no one ever touched. The clinician greeted me with a practiced calm. "This isn't disciplinary," she said. "It's a check-in." I sat down and placed my hands flat on the table. "Understood." She asked about sleep, focus, appetite. She asked about Daniel without using his name at first, then corrected herself when she realized the omission was worse. I answered in complete sentences, not clipped, not verbose. "Have you felt targeted lately?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "In what way?" I described the observations, the repeated sightings, the mall incident, the phone audio. I didn't mention Margaret. She nodded, typing. "How does that make you feel?" "Alert," I said. She paused. "Anything else?" "Concerned about privacy." She wrote that down too. The next meeting was with a different face and the same questions, then another. Each time the emphasis shifted slightly. Less about the observer, more about me. Stress can amplify perception. Grief changes sensitivity. Patterns can appear when we're looking for them. I didn't argue. I didn't agree either. I returned to my desk and kept working. By the 3rd day, my calendar had more gray blocks than usual. Wellness check, administrative review, optional counseling session marked as recommended. Marissa noticed the change before I said anything. "They're circling you," she said, watching me scroll through my schedule. "They're evaluating," I replied. "That's different, is it?" "Yes." I went anyway. To all of it, I answered questions. I kept my tone neutral. I didn't volunteer Margaret's name because I didn't need to yet. Accusations land better when they aren't emotional. Meanwhile, the watching didn't stop. A man waited across the street from my building one evening, pretending to tie his shoe until Marissa stepped outside. He left immediately. At the base gate, a car I didn't recognize slowed when I scanned my badge. The driver looked away too late. I logged everything. By Friday, the report had been escalated. That was the word used, escalated. I was asked to provide additional context, screenshots, my calendar, phone logs. I complied. Then came the question that changed the temperature of the room. "Is there anyone in your personal life who might be concerned about your stability?" the administrator asked, "or who has expressed worries about your workload?" I looked at him. Not long. Long enough. Yes, I said. Who? My mother-in-law. He nodded slowly. And how is that relationship? Complicated. He typed. Has she contacted anyone on your behalf? I don't know. That answer was honest. It wasn't complete. After the meeting, I walked back to my car, with the sense that the ground had shifted under my feet. Not dramatically, subtly, like a chair being moved an inch closer without asking. At home, Marissa was waiting with her arms crossed. They called me, she said. Who? Someone from a support office. Asked how you were holding up. What did you say? She shrugged. That you're functioning, that you're careful, that you're not imagining things. That may not help. It's the truth. Truth doesn't always move systems. It just gives them something to weigh. That night, Margaret called again. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice sounded pleased. I heard you're taking steps to get support. That's good. Very responsible. I deleted it. The next morning, Thomas Reed's name appeared in my email inbox. Subject line, request for clarification. No greeting, no explanation. Just a request to confirm whether the audio I had recorded had been shared beyond mall security. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to the administrator handling my case. Within the hour, I was asked to come in again. This complicates things, he said, tapping the screen. It clarifies them, I replied. He studied me. Do you understand how this looks? Yes, I said. It looks like I reported surveillance and then became the subject of review. That's not what's happening. It is adjacent. He leaned back. We have to rule out internal factors. Rule them out, I said, with evidence. He nodded once. We will. That afternoon, my access to certain systems was temporarily limited. Not revoked, adjusted. It wasn't punitive. It was protective. That's what they said. I went home and told Marissa. They're testing you, she said, to see if you crack. I won't, I know. Outside, a delivery van parked across the street and stayed there longer than necessary. When I stepped onto the balcony, it drove off. I wrote it down. By the end of the week, the tone had changed again. Less suggestion, more formality. The kind that comes when multiple departments start sharing notes. I received a message from the administrator. We've identified a contractor connected to your report. Further review is underway. No names, no conclusions. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair. The apartment was quiet. Marissa was on the phone in the other room, her voice low and steady. Being questioned hadn't shaken me. It had clarified the stakes. When systems get involved, precision matters, timing matters, and most of all, patience matters. I picked up my phone and opened the document. Added one more entry, internal review initiated. Then I closed it, stood up, and went to make dinner like nothing had changed, because routines still had their place, even when the scrutiny shifted closer to home. The email sat unopened for a full minute before I clicked it. Not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I wanted my hands steady when I read it. The subject line was plain. Administrative update. Inside, the language was careful. A contractor connected to a recent incident had been identified. Questions had been raised about scope of work. Documentation was being reviewed. I was requested to attend a follow-up meeting the next morning. No names yet. No conclusions. Just enough to shift the center of gravity. At the meeting, the administrator slid a thin folder across the table. He didn't open it. I did. Thomas Reed, his full name, license number, business address, a list of invoices attached to a single contract. What you're seeing, the administrator said, is what we have so far. The contract wasn't long, 2 pages, clean formatting, no dramatic language. Services described as observation and documentation. Public settings only. No direct contact. No trespass. The client name was blacked out. Who hired him, I asked. He met my eyes. We're confirming that. I read the scope again. The wording was careful in the way lawyers like. Observe daily routines. Note deviations. Assess stability indicators. Compile a narrative summary. Narrative summary stood out. This isn't about safety, I said. No, he replied. It's about evaluation. I nodded once and closed the folder. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and worked until noon. Routine still mattered. It kept everything proportional. At lunch, Marissa called. They were outside again, she said. Different car, same behavior. Did they approach? No. Did you document? Yes. That night, I didn't wait for Margaret to call. I drove to her house. She opened the door with a surprised smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Elena, she said, you should have called. I'm not staying long, I replied. Her living room was immaculate, everything in its place. Framed photos lined the mantel. Daniel at various ages, Daniel in uniform. Daniel smiling in a way that suggested he'd been told to. She gestured toward the couch. I stayed standing. They've identified the contractor, I said. She didn't ask which one. That's good, she replied. I'm glad you're being taken seriously. They found the contract. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the coffee table, then relaxed. You always were observant, she said. I watched her face carefully, not for guilt, for calculation. Who signed it, I asked. She sighed like the question was a burden. I did. There it was, no denial, no drama, just confirmation. Why, I asked. She looked genuinely puzzled. Because someone had to watch me, to understand what was happening, she corrected. You've been through a trauma. You went back too fast. People were worried. People, I said. She waved a hand. Friends, community members, people who cared about Daniel. None of them hired a private contractor. She leaned forward. You're being defensive. I'm being accurate. She straightened. I didn't break any laws. That's not the same as being right. Her eyes hardened. You don't get to decide that. I left without raising my voice, without threatening, without promising consequences. Back at home, Marissa listened quietly while I told her everything. She admitted it, Marissa said. Yes, that's not normal. No, the next morning, the black bar over the client name was gone. Margaret Brooks. Seeing it in print landed differently than hearing it out loud. Less emotional, more permanent. The administrator spoke carefully. This changes how we proceed, how I asked. It establishes intent and impact. Yes, Reed was brought in that afternoon, not as a suspect, as a contractor under review. He didn't look surprised to see me in the room. You didn't tell me she was your mother-in-law, he said calmly. You didn't ask, I replied. I assumed distance. That was your mistake. He shrugged. My job was to observe. I stayed within bounds. You followed my sister into a restroom, I said. He held up a hand. I didn't enter a stall. That's not the standard. The administrator cleared his throat. Mr. Reed, did you understand the purpose of this observation? Yes, Reed replied. To document behavioral indicators relevant to fitness and stability. Whose fitness? The administrator asked. Reed hesitated. Just for a beat. Elena's. And who requested that? Mrs. Brooks. Did she specify an outcome? Reed glanced at me, then back at the administrator. She wanted clarity. I laughed once. It surprised everyone, including me. Clarity, I said. You don't hire someone to follow a person around for clarity. Reed didn't respond. The meeting ended with outraised voices or slammed doors, just notes taken, statements recorded, boundaries defined. When I got home, Marissa was sitting at the table with her laptop open. She emailed me, Marissa said. Margaret, yes, I didn't need to read it to know what it said. She says she was trying to protect you. Marissa continued, that she was afraid you were spiraling. I wasn't, I know. What did you reply? Nothing. That was the right answer. Over the next few days, the tone shifted again, this time away from me, away from my behavior, toward hers. Margaret called twice. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. I deleted it. At work, my access was restored gradually, not ceremoniously, quietly. The kind of correction systems make when they realized they were looking in the wrong direction. Reed's contract was suspended, not terminated yet. Suspended pending review. I added the date to my document. Marissa noticed the change in the street outside first. Fewer cars lingering, less casual pacing. The rhythm broke. That didn't mean the damage was undone. It meant the shape of it was changing. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, my phone buzzed again. A message from Margaret. We need to talk. This has gone too far. I set the phone down without responding and dried my hands slowly. Control doesn't disappear when it's exposed. It adapts. I walked into the living room where Marissa was watching the street and joined her by the window. Both of us silent. Both of us aware that names had finally been attached to actions, and that once that happens, things don't return to their previous shape. I didn't answer the message right away. I wiped the counter, stacked the plates, and put the phone face down, like it couldn't see me if I didn't look at it. Control changes shape when it's cornered. It stops asking and starts justifying. Margaret showed up the next afternoon without calling. She rang the bell once and waited. No knocking, no pacing. When I opened the door, she stood straight, coat buttoned, expression composed. We should clear this up, she said. Come in, I replied, stepping aside. Marissa stayed in the kitchen, close enough to hear, far enough to keep the room honest. Margaret sat on the edge of the couch like she was visiting an office, not her daughter-in-law's home. She didn't look around. She didn't touch anything. She clasped her hands and took a breath that sounded rehearsed. I never meant to hurt you, she began. I know, I said. That threw her. She blinked. You do? Yes, I continued. You meant to manage me. She tightened her jaw. I meant to protect what matters. What matters to you? She leaned forward. Daniel is gone. Someone has to make sure his life meant something. It did, I said. To him, to me. That's not what I mean, she replied. Legacy isn't just memory, it's how things continue. Through control, I said. Through responsibility, she corrected. You went back to work too fast. You shut people out. You refused help. I refused interference. She shook her head. You're too close to this to see clearly. I glanced toward the kitchen. Marissa hadn't moved. Let's be specific, I said. You hired a contractor to observe me. Yes. To assess my stability. Yes. To build a narrative. She hesitated. To understand patterns. Patterns you could use. She exhaled. You're in the military. You know evaluations matter. I know evidence matters, I said. And perception, she replied. Perception shapes outcomes. There it was. Not love, not grief. Outcomes. You spoke to people, I said. At base. In the community. She didn't deny it. I asked questions. You framed them. I shared concerns. About my fitness. About your well-being, she said. About whether you were pushing past what was healthy. And if the answer came back negative, I asked what then. She looked away. Just briefly. I would have stepped in, she said. Made sure decisions weren't made while you were compromised. Compromised, I repeated. You lost my son. I lost my husband. She looked back at me. And that changes you. Yes, I said. It doesn't disqualify me. She pressed her lips together. I didn't trust the system to move fast enough. So you worked around it. I worked with it, she said. Legally. You followed my sister into a restroom. That was him, she said quickly. I didn't instruct that. You paid for the outcome. She didn't argue that. Marissa spoke from the kitchen. You weren't worried she'd break, she said. You were worried she wouldn't bend. Margaret turned toward her. You don't understand. Marissa stepped into the room. I understand perfectly. You wanted leverage. Margaret stood. I wanted a safeguard against what I asked. Me being independent against you making decisions alone. That's called adulthood. Her voice rose slightly. Daniel trusted me. He trusted me too, I said. Enough to marry me. That doesn't mean you see everything. It means I see my own life. She picked up her purse. You're framing this as an attack. Because it was. She shook her head. You'll thank me one day. No, I replied. I'll remember this. She paused at the door. You've made this bigger than it needed to be. You made it bigger when you hired someone to follow me. She left without another word. The apartment felt quieter after she was gone. Not calmer, just clearer. At work, the findings moved forward. Not with drama, with memos. Reed's statements were added to the file. His invoices matched the dates. The scope matched the behavior. The phrase narrative summary appeared again, this time highlighted. Margaret's involvement reframed everything. The questions I'd been asked, the timing of the wellness checks, the sudden interest in my schedule. It all lined up once the motive was named. I was called in for one more meeting. This time the tone was different. We should have seen this earlier, the administrator said. We're adjusting course. How, I asked. By narrowing focus, he replied. And documenting interference. Interference with what? With your autonomy. I nodded. That afternoon, a community liaison contacted Margaret. Not accusatory, informational. Boundaries were outlined, expectations clarified. She called me afterward. I didn't answer. She sent a message. I was trying to help. I didn't respond. Marissa watched me type and stop again. You don't owe her closure, she said. I know. The following days were a lesson in what happens when justification runs out of space. Margaret spoke less. When she did, her words were careful, defensive, focused on how this looked to others. I noticed which names stopped appearing in her stories, which invitations dried up, which calls went unanswered. Control depends on access. When access narrows, the tone changes. At base, my restrictions were lifted. Quietly, no announcement, no apology, just restored access and an updated calendar. Reed's contract was terminated by the end of the week, not because of emotion, because the risk outweighed the value. I added the final note to my document. Client intent established. Then I closed it. Not because everything was resolved, but because the shape of the problem had shifted. When motives are exposed, consequences stop being abstract. One evening, as Marissa and I sat on the balcony watching the street below, a car passed without slowing. Another followed. Normal traffic doing normal things. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. It was true. Not because nothing had happened. Because what had happened was finally being named for what it was. Control dressed up as concern doesn't survive daylight. It only survives silence. The first thing to change was the phone calls. Margaret had always called like time belonged to her short rings. Immediate answers expected. Now there were gaps, hours, sometimes days, when she did call. Her voice sounded measured, like she was reading from a script she hadn't rehearsed enough. "I just wanted to see how you're doing," she said one afternoon. "I'm fine," I replied. "That's good," she said. Then added quickly, "I've been getting some strange questions lately." "From who?" "People," she said. "Friends." I didn't ask which ones. I already knew. At work, the shift was more noticeable. Emails that used to CC Margaret out of habit no longer did. A community coordinator stopped by my office to clarify a boundary that should have been obvious months earlier. Another apologized without using the word apology. "We assumed," he said. "We shouldn't have." Assumptions lose their footing once motives are documented. Reed's suspension turned into something heavier. Not charges, not yet, but a formal inquiry into his practices. He called once, left a voicemail. I stayed inside the lines, he said. That's on record. What he didn't say was that the lines had moved. Marissa noticed the neighborhood before I did. The familiar cars stopped lingering. The casual loitering evaporated. When she walked to the store, no one matched her pace. When she came back, she didn't circle the block anymore. "They're gone," she said one evening standing by the window. "For now," I replied. Margaret tried a different approach. She came to base during an open event not to see me, she said, but to support the community. She shook hands, smiled, talked about Daniel with practiced warmth. Then someone asked her about the contractor. The pause was small, barely there, enough. By the end of the week, she stopped attending those events. At home, mail started arriving addressed to her that didn't belong there anymore. Notices, clarifications. One letter referenced an ethics review tied to her role in a local veterans organization. Another outlined revised guidelines for family involvement. She dropped by unannounced again. This time she stood in the doorway longer than usual, like she wasn't sure she still belonged there. "They're painting me like a villain," she said. "They're describing your actions," I replied. "That's not fair. It's accurate." She stepped inside without waiting for permission. Her eyes moved around the apartment like she was cataloging changes. Nothing had moved. The shift wasn't physical. "You've ruined my reputation," she said. "You did that yourself." Her voice tightened. "People are whispering." "I know," I said. "I've heard it before." She sat down heavily. "They don't understand. They don't need to." She looked up at me. "You could fix this." I didn't respond. "If you explained," she continued. "If you told them it was a misunderstanding." "It wasn't." She shook her head. "You don't see what this costs me. I see it clearly." That was when she stopped framing it as concern and started framing it as loss. "I gave everything to that community," she said. "Everything. You used it," Marissa said from the kitchen. "Like leverage." Margaret flinched. "I was respected," she said. "Until now." She stood abruptly. "You're enjoying this?" "No," I replied. "I'm surviving it." At work, the final review cleared my name without ceremony. Access restored, notes amended, the wellness flag removed, no announcement. Just a quiet correction in the system. I noticed the absence more than the fix, silence where scrutiny had lived. Reed sent one more message. Short, controlled. "Your mother-in-law is no longer my client." I didn't reply. Margaret's calls became erratic, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes nostalgic. "You remember when Daniel was little," she said once, voice soft. "He hated being alone." "He grew up," I said. She tried guilt next, then concern, then nothing. The community fallout spread outward, not with drama, but with distance. Invitations stopped. Leadership roles shifted. People who had once deferred to her now redirected questions elsewhere. Control doesn't collapse loudly, it erodes. One evening, Marissa and I walked past a cafe Margaret used to frequent. She sat alone inside, staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She didn't see us. Marissa slowed. "Do you want to talk to her?" "No," I said. We kept walking. At home, I filed the last update to the document and closed it for good. Not because there was nothing left to record, but because the pattern had completed its cycle. Action, exposure, consequence. Margaret called later that night. I answered. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she said. "It did. I was trying to help. You were trying to decide." She went quiet. "Then you could have stopped this." "I did," I replied, "by telling the truth." After we hung up, the apartment settled into its usual sounds. The fridge, the pipes, a car passing outside without slowing. Marissa looked at me. "You okay?" "Yes." I meant it. The collapse wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no final showdown. Just a steady withdrawal of influence until there was nothing left to pull on. Power depends on belief. Once that breaks, everything else follows. The change wasn't announced. It showed up in small ways that added up. My calendar cleared itself of gray blocks. Meetings returned to their usual cadence. People spoke to me the way they had before. Direct and unguarded, like there was no longer an extra layer of interpretation between what I said and what they heard. I kept my routine simple. Same wake-up time, same drive, same coffee I didn't actually enjoy but drank anyway. Stability isn't dramatic, it's repetitive. Margaret didn't stop calling entirely. She just stopped expecting answers. When she did reach me, her tone stayed careful, like she was testing a surface she no longer trusted to hold her weight. "I'm trying to respect your space," she said during one call. "That's good," I replied. There was nothing else to add. At base, the administrator I'd met with before stopped me in the hallway. No clipboard this time. No formal tone. "We've closed the internal review," he said. "Your record reflects that." "Thank you," I replied. He hesitated. "For what it's worth, you handled this the right way." I nodded once and kept walking. At home, Marissa started packing boxes. Not because she was being pushed out, because she was ready to move forward. Her own place, her own terms. "This isn't you leaving me," I said. She smiled. "This is me not needing to hide." We stacked boxes in the corner and labeled them with thick black marker. Kitchen, books, clothes. Normal words for normal transitions. Margaret showed up once more without warning. This time she stood on the sidewalk and waited for me to come down instead of ringing the bell. "I won't come up," she said when I reached her. "I just wanted to say something." I folded my arms. "Go ahead." "I understand now that I crossed a line," she said. "That's a start." I didn't mean to lose everything, she added. "I didn't take everything," I replied. "I took back what was mine." She nodded slowly. "I thought boundaries were something you set for strangers. They're for everyone," I said. She looked older standing there, not frail, just smaller. Like the space she occupied had finally adjusted to match the truth. "Daniel would have wanted peace," she said. "He would have wanted respect," I replied. She didn't argue that. When she left, I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. Things were finally sitting where they belonged. Marissa moved out 2 weeks later. We hugged at the door, not the kind of hug that clings. The kind that acknowledges. "You did good," she said. "So did you." The apartment felt quieter afterward, but not empty. Quiet can be earned. At work, a new project landed on my desk. Logistics support, tight timeline, clear expectations. I accepted it without hesitation. People stopped asking how I was holding up. They asked what I needed. That was progress. Margaret tried one last maneuver. A letter delivered by mail, neatly typed. No accusations, no apologies. Just a request for supervised contact at specific intervals, framed as family maintenance. I read it once and filed it without response. Boundaries don't require constant reinforcement. They require consistency. Weeks passed, then months. The community adjusted. Roles shifted. Names faded from the center of conversations. Margaret attended fewer events. When she did, she stayed on the edges. Control doesn't vanish. It loses its audience. One afternoon, I ran into Reed by accident outside a courthouse. He looked thinner, less confident. He nodded like someone acknowledging a shared inconvenience. "Hard lesson," he said. "For you," I replied. He shrugged. "For everyone." I didn't stay to talk. At home that evening, I cooked dinner and listened to the radio without really hearing it. The phone stayed face down. No messages, no updates. This was the version of calm that comes after decisions stick. When Margaret called later that week, I answered. "I'm trying to understand where I fit now," she said. "That's something you decide," I replied. "Not something you enforce." There was a long pause. "I'll respect that," she said. "Good." After we hung up, I stood at the window and watched the street. Cars passed. People walked dogs. A couple argued quietly on the corner, then laughed about it. Ordinary life resumed its place. Boundaries aren't walls, they're lines that tell everyone where to stand, so no one has to guess. I went to bed at my usual time and slept through the night, the kind of sleep that doesn't feel like escape or recovery. Just rest. The next morning I woke up early, laced my boots, and headed out with the steady understanding that nothing was watching me anymore. And if something ever tried again, it would meet a life that had already learned how to say no and mean it. Morning came the same way it always did, without ceremony. Light through the blinds, the sound of someone starting a car down the street. I sat on the edge of the bed and tied my boots, not rushing, not delaying. The mirror didn't show anything new, which was exactly the point. At work, the project moved forward. Deadlines stayed tight. People argued about priorities and solved them. I did my part and left the rest alone. That rhythm, once interrupted, had returned without apology. Systems don't apologize, they correct. During a break, a junior officer asked me how to handle a family situation that was getting complicated. He didn't give details. He didn't need to. I told him to write everything down and stop explaining himself to people who didn't need explanations. He nodded like he'd just been given permission to breathe. That afternoon, an email circulated announcing a change in leadership for a local veterans committee. It didn't mention Margaret by name. It didn't have to. The language was neutral, transitional, thankful for past service, looking ahead. I closed the email and went back to work. Margaret didn't disappear. She adjusted. That's what people do when control stops working. They negotiate with reality, sometimes quietly, sometimes with resentment that never quite finds a target. When she did reach out, it stayed within the lines. Short messages, clear requests. No assumptions about access, no attempts to triangulate through other people. "I'd like to meet for coffee," she wrote once. "Public place. Your choice." I agreed. The cafe was bright and loud enough to keep the conversation grounded. She arrived early and waited, hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. She didn't stand when I approached. She didn't reach out. "I won't stay long," I said. "That's fine," she replied. She talked about the weather, about a neighbor moving away, about nothing that mattered. Then she stopped. "I didn't understand what I was doing," she said. "Not really. I think you did," I replied. "You just didn't want to call it that." She nodded. "Control sounds ugly." "It is," I said. "That's why people rename it." She looked down. "I thought if I managed things, everyone would be safer." "Safe isn't the same as small," I said. She absorbed that without arguing. When we stood to leave, she didn't ask when she'd see me again. She said, "Thank you for meeting me where I am." "That's the only place meetings work," I replied. Outside, life continued without commentary. A line of people waited for coffee. A cyclist weaved through traffic. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't that funny. The city didn't pause for closure. Marissa called that evening from her new place. The echo in her living room told me she hadn't unpacked everything yet. "I slept through the night," she said. "First time in a while." "Good," I replied. "I keep expecting to hear footsteps outside my door." "You will," I said. "They just won't mean anything anymore." She laughed. Not the brittle kind, the relaxed kind. At home, the apartment felt settled. Not quiet because it was empty, but quiet because nothing was pressing against it. I cooked, cleaned, and set my phone on the counter without checking it every few minutes. Habits relax when vigilance retires. Weeks folded into each other. Work stayed demanding. My name moved up a list I hadn't asked about. No one mentioned the review anymore. It had become background noise, then silence. Margaret sent a holiday card. No subtext. No handwritten notes in the margins. Just her name and a generic message about wishing me well. I placed it on the shelf with the others and didn't read into it. Reed never contacted me again. I heard through someone else that he'd pivoted his business toward corporate compliance audits. Less personal, less intimate, less profitable in the short term, safer. Control has a cost. It always does. Sometimes it's reputation. Sometimes it's access. Sometimes it's the quiet understanding that people now see you clearly And clarity isn't flattering. One afternoon, as I walked home from work, a familiar street caught my attention. Same storefronts, same corner where I'd once pretended to read labels while watching reflections. I passed it without slowing, no mirrors needed. At the apartment, I opened the old document one last time, not to add anything, to confirm there was nothing left to add. Dates ended where they should. Notes concluded without trailing thoughts. I deleted the file, not because the past had vanished, because it no longer needed a container. Later, a colleague invited me to a small gathering. Nothing formal, just food and conversation. I went. I stayed an hour. I left when I felt done, no explanations required. On the walk back, the night air felt ordinary. That was the win. Not triumph, not vindication, ordinary. People often think revenge looks like satisfaction. It doesn't. It looks like alignment. The moment when someone's ability to reach into your life ends not with drama, but with acceptance. Margaret learned that control had narrowed her world. Reed learned that proximity has limits. The system learned that concern can be weaponized if no one questions the source. I learned something simpler. Boundaries don't change other people. They change what other people are allowed to touch. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm and lay there for a minute listening. Nothing unusual, no footsteps, no engines idling too long. Just the sound of a building waking up, of people going where they needed to go. I got up, dressed, and stepped outside into a day that didn't belong to anyone else.